What if I told you that the pioneers' main battle in the Wild West began not at dawn, but at dusk? We imagine sleeping in a log cabin as something cozy with a crackling fire. But the reality was quite different. It was not a night of rest, but a long watch where the price of a mistake was too high. The whole life of the family from sunset to sunrise revolved around one element: the flickering embers in the hearth. This fire was both a savior and the greatest threat hidden in the heart of the home. Every night turned into a complex ritual full of carefully calculated actions and unspoken rules. It required vigilance, knowledge, and constant readiness for the worst. A simple sleep by the hearth was in fact a complex security system honed by generations. Mistakes in this ritual were unforgivable because everything was at stake. This daily drama unfolded in millions of cabins, dugouts, and temporary shelters across the frontier. It defined everyday life, shaped character, and dictated its own harsh laws. Watch the video to the end to find out how ordinary settlers managed this element inside their homes, why sleeping alone was almost impossible, and what simple household item was more important than a gun for nighttime safety. What if I told you that pioneers needed fire in their hearths not so much for warmth as for peace of mind? In a world where civilization ended at your doorstep, the night did not belong to man. It was a time of vast, oppressive darkness on the Great Plains, filled with uncertainty. Fire was the only thing that could counteract this primal fear. The flickering light in the only window of the log cabin was not just a landmark. It was a psychological shield that literally separated a small island of human life from the boundless ocean of wilderness. As long as the fire burned, the house remained a fortress, a place of order and control. The fading of the fire symbolized surrender to chaos. That is why the hearth was not just a source of heat, but the sacred center of the home. All life in the room was organized around it, and at night its importance only increased. It was a living being, a companion that stayed awake with the family. Its quiet crackling was the only sound that broke the oppressive silence. This psychological dependence was incredibly strong. People felt safe as long as they could see the reflections of the flames on the walls. It was visual confirmation that the protection was not broken, that the barrier between the inner and outer worlds was still intact. Fire was an anchor that kept the mind grounded in isolation. We often overlook this aspect, focusing on the practical side of survival. But for a settler whose nearest neighbors might be a day's journey away, mental fortitude was as important as physical strength. Fire provided not only warmth for the body, but peace for the mind. It was the only ally in the long night battle. This concept of the hearth as a mental barrier is one of the most underrated in frontier history. People didn't just stoke the stove, they maintained a symbol of their presence in this harsh world. Fire was proof that they were still here and had not given up. Even in later periods, with the advent of cast iron stoves, the open hearth remained popular for a long time. It provided not only effective heat, but also a living, open light. This visual component was critical to psychological comfort. It is difficult for modern people to imagine the depth of this attachment. We take darkness for granted, something that can be defeated with the flick of a switch. For the pioneer, darkness was the enemy, and the hearth was the only warrior on his side. This unspoken role of fire as a protector of mental health was fundamental. It witnessed all the nighttime conversations, fears, and hopes. Falling asleep without seeing its light meant being left completely alone against the whole world. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. Which element of daily life do you think was more important for the spirit of the pioneers? A reliable bolt on the door or an inexhaustible fire in the hearth? Write about it in the comments and be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other stories about survival on the frontier. Are you ready to learn the truth about how a pioneer's hearth was really built? Forget about the neat brick fireplaces you see in movies. In the early frontier, the hearth was a massive, rough, and often dangerous structure that took up an entire wall of a small hut. Its design was dictated not by aesthetics, but by pure necessity and available materials. Most often, the hearth was built from fieldstones, if they could be found nearby. The stones were held together with clay mortar mixed with grass or straw for strength. It was a laborious construction process that required considerable effort, but the result was worth it as the stone retained heat well and was relatively fireproof. If stones were not available, as was the case on the Great Plains, for example, the hearth was made of turf. In dugouts or sod houses, the hearth was cut directly into the earthen wall. This was a quick solution, but it was extremely short-lived and required constant repair. The clay crumbled and the dampness made lighting a fire a real challenge. In wooded areas where log cabins were built, the hearth was often made of wood and clay. First, a frame was knocked together from logs, which was then thickly coated with clay inside and out. This construction, known as cat and clay, was cheap but carried a deadly threat, which we will discuss later. The size of the hearth was important. It had to be large enough to accommodate several pots and pans at once. It was not just used for cooking, it was used to boil water for washing, melt snow, heat water for washing, and even melt lead for bullets. It was a true multifunctional workstation. In fact, the entire one-room hut was built around the hearth. It dictated the layout and how people moved around the space. The places closest to the fire were the most valuable and were reserved for the most important nighttime activities. The floor in front of the hearth was a place for work and rest. At night, the hearth became the only source of light. All nighttime activities, repairing tools, mending clothes, loading weapons, took place in its uneven, pulsating light. This created a special atmosphere where the shadows on the walls seemed long and alive. A massive wooden shelf called a mantelpiece was often built above the hearth. It was not a decoration, but an important storage place. Herbs were dried there, salt was stored, and tinder and flint were kept dry. Everything that was susceptible to dampness found its place closer to the heat. The floor in front of the hearth was the biggest problem. In early huts, it was simply earthen. It was fireproof, but dirty and cold. Later, floors were made of hewn logs, but the space directly in front of the hearth was often left earthen or laid out with flat stones. The design of the hearth determined how warm and safe the night would be. A mistake in calculations, the wrong mixture of clay, or an incorrectly chosen stone could lead to poor draft, smoke, or even fire. It was the heart of the home, and it required constant attention. But the hearth itself was only half of the system. Equally important was the chimney, which carried hidden and deadly risks. Ready to find out why the simplest part of the fireplace was its most dangerous? In the next chapter, we'll reveal the secrets of sticky chimneys and their battle with fire. What I am about to tell you cannot be found in romantic novels about the Wild West, but this secret determined whether a family would wake up in their home or in ashes. We talked about cat and clay hearths, primitive chimneys built from sticks and clay. This type of construction was widespread, especially among poor settlers and in the early years of frontier development. But its main drawback was not only its fragility. Chimneys of this type were extremely combustible, putting the lives of the entire family at risk. Cat and clay chimneys gained popularity due to their low cost and simplicity of construction. A frame made of branches or poles was coated with a thick layer of clay to keep smoke and heat inside. As long as the clay layer remained intact, everything worked properly. The fire in the hearth drew smoke through the pipe, and the heat remained inside the house. But over time, the clay began to crack due to high temperatures and temperature fluctuations, which were inevitable in harsh winters. These cracks in the clay soon exposed the wooden frame, and creosote, a resinous, flammable coating produced by burning wood, gradually accumulated inside the chimney, settling on the walls of the pipe. Once the wooden elements of the structure were exposed and a layer of creosote had accumulated inside the chimney became a dangerous trap. The mixture of wood and resin became a veritable match, ready to ignite from any spark. A single strong spark from the hearth was enough to ignite the creosote, and in an instant, a chimney fire broke out. It was a truly terrifying sight. A roaring column of flame burst from the pipe, resembling a rocket engine. The flames did not just burn, they roared, filling the air with a terrifying sound that was impossible to ignore. The temperature in the pipe was so high that the clay cracked, and the wooden frame of the chimney caught fire instantly. When the fire began to engulf the chimney, it could spread to the roof of the house in a matter of minutes. A fire that started with a single spark quickly engulfed the wooden roof, which in most cases was dry and brittle. At that point, it was almost impossible to save the hut. The flames spread at an incredible speed, and the family was likely left homeless in a very short time. Many houses were destroyed in this way, and the frontier settlers, especially in the early years, learned to respect this threat and take care of their chimneys as the most vulnerable part of their homes. Combating creosote was vital, and there were special methods for cleaning chimneys. Chimneys had to be cleaned regularly to remove accumulated deposits and reduce the risk of fire. This work was dirty, unpleasant, and dangerous. One of the most common techniques involved using a rope to which a bundle of thorny branches was tied. This brush tool was dragged through the pipe to mechanically remove soot and creosote. Wind or rain could greatly affect the effectiveness of this method, and the work required skill and experience. A more radical but risky method was to burn out the chimney. In this case, the homeowner deliberately set fire to the soot inside the pipe to destroy the accumulated creosote. However, this method was dangerous because a mistake could cause the fire to get out of control. Burning was carried out under strictly controlled conditions, for example, during heavy rain when the roof was wet, which reduced the likelihood of the fire spreading quickly. It was like playing with fire, where a mistake could be extremely dangerous. Some structures included safety measures. For example, the upper part of the chimney was sometimes built so that it could be easily broken and thrown off the roof in case of fire. This allowed the fire to be cut off from the main structure, giving owners a few extra minutes to evacuate and save their property. But even with such safety measures, many families, especially those who did not have sufficient resources or knowledge, found themselves unprotected from this threat. Stone chimneys were certainly much safer than wooden structures, but they had their own problems. For example, creosote also accumulated in the joints between the stones, and if the pipe was built incorrectly, or if the stones began to crack, the chimney could collapse under its own weight or from exposure to heat. This added additional risks, and even in houses with stone pipes, regular inspection and cleaning of chimneys was required. Thus, the chimney was not just a pipe for smoke, but also the Achilles heel of the entire house. It required constant monitoring, cleaning, and repair to avoid disaster. At night, when the family was asleep, everyone listened for sounds coming from the pipe. Any unusual rumbling or crackling could mean the beginning of a disaster. If the temperature inside the chimney rose too sharply, or if sounds began that were not characteristic of the normal combustion process, the owners immediately began to check and, if necessary, took action. It is important to note that chimneys were not only a source of danger, but also part of the culture of survival on the frontier. For those who lived in remote areas, understanding all the nuances of working with a chimney could be a matter of life and death. If you find such little-known but critical details of frontier survival important, please support us with a like, and we will continue to share this unique historical experience. Want to know the secret that allowed people to sleep a few feet away from an open fire without burning up? The answer lies not in magic, but in a strict set of rules and simple tools. Controlling sparks was the main nighttime ritual, and everything depended on it. The first line of defense was the hearth itself. It was made deep, with a high threshold. This helped keep most of the coals and ashes inside. But flying sparks were inevitable, especially if the wood was resinous, like pine, or if moisture got into the fire. Sparks posed a threat to everything in the room. Wooden floors, straw mattresses, clothes hanging to dry. All of these could catch fire from a single ember. Therefore, the floor in front of the hearth required special attention. As we have already mentioned, it was often left earthen or paved with stone. If the floor was wooden, a large flat stone or sheet of metal was placed in front of the hearth, if one could be obtained. This was an improvised spark arrestor. At night, a rolling ember could fall on this sheet, and it had no chance of setting the boards on fire. Dampers were used to protect sleeping people. These were not always the metal dampers that we imagine in a chimney. Often, it was a simple screen that was placed in front of the fire at night. It could be made of anything, a frame covered with burlap, or even woven willow twigs. Such a screen did not block the heat, but it effectively caught most of the flying sparks. It was a must-have in any home where safety was valued. In the morning, dozens of small burn holes could be seen on it, each of which could have caused a fire. Another important element was the damper in the chimney itself, or in dampers. It was a metal plate that covered the pipe. At night, it was partially covered. This reduced the draft, causing the wood to burn more slowly and economically. But there was a downside to this. If the damper was covered too much, smoke and carbon monoxide could start to enter the room. Finding the right balance between retaining heat, saving wood, and ensuring safe ventilation was a real art. And of course, don't forget about water. There was always a bucket of water next to the hearth. It was not for drinking, but for emergencies. If a spark did fall on the floor or bed, it had to be doused immediately without wasting a second. All these measures, from stone floors to buckets of water, were part of a multi-level safety system. It was primitive, but when done right, it worked. But what happened when the wood burned out? In the next chapter, we'll learn the main secret to keeping the fire going until morning. One of the most important skills for any settler was not how to start a fire, but how to keep it going. On the frontier, matches were expensive and sometimes unavailable. Using flint and steel required skill, and more importantly, dry tinder, which was not always available on cold, damp mornings. Therefore, the main task before going to bed was to bank the fire. This term meant preserving the burning coals until morning. It was a ritual that was performed with great care. Its success determined whether the house would be warm and there would be a hot breakfast, or whether the morning would begin with a tedious struggle to get a spark. The process began with preparation. During the evening, the best logs were selected, from hardwoods such as oak or hickory. They burned slowly and produced large, long-lasting coals. Softwoods such as pine burned too quickly and were not suitable for this purpose. As the family prepared for bed, these large logs and the bulk of the hot coals were raked into the center of the hearth. Then they were completely covered with a thick layer of ash. The ash served as an ideal insulator. It blocked the oxygen supply, preventing the coals from burning but retaining their heat. It was similar to how we cover ourselves with a blanket. The layer of ash had to be thick enough to prevent the coals from flaring up during the night, but not so thick as to extinguish them completely. It was a fine line that every homeowner felt intuitively. In the morning, the first person to wake up, usually the one who had kept watch during the night, would go to the hearth. He would carefully rake through the gray, cold-looking pile of ashes. At its very heart, he would find a treasure. Bright red, heat-breathing coals that had smoldered all night. All you had to do was put a little dry wood chips, moss, or other tinder on these coals and blow gently. The fire was instantly revived, ready for a new day. It was like a little daily miracle. When a family moved, the bank with the fire was often the most valuable cargo. The coals were placed in a special metal box or clay pot and covered with ashes. They were transported with incredible care because losing the fire on the way meant serious problems. This skill was so fundamental that not having it was considered a sign of a bad housekeeper or host. The ability to preserve fire was synonymous with order, thriftiness, and proper housekeeping. At night, this sleeping fire under a layer of ashes still radiated a little heat. It prevented the room from cooling down completely. It was a safe, slow heat that kept life in the house going until dawn. The entire system of nightlife revolved around this process. It saved resources, saved time, and provided confidence in the future. For a pioneer, a morning that began with ready-made coals was a good morning. Want to know why almost no one in the Wild West slept really soundly? Sleep as we understand it today, 8 hours of uninterrupted rest in a comfortable bed, was an unthinkable luxury for a settler. Night on the frontier was not a time for rest, but a time for constant vigilance. In harsh conditions where any mistake could cost a life, sleep became not only rare, but also dangerous. Most families in the Wild West practiced taking turns sleeping, which meant that not all family members slept at the same time. It was a necessary compromise dictated by the harsh conditions of life. There were two reasons for this arrangement, both of which were vital. The first was fire. As we have already mentioned, fire was a friend, but at the same time a serious enemy. It could provide warmth, but it was also capable of causing disaster if not properly monitored. Fire was not only a source of light and heat, but also a potential threat that could burn down an entire hut in a matter of minutes. The fire had to be monitored constantly, even if it was banked under the ashes for the night. Not every village had the ability to maintain a fire around the clock, but the need to maintain a minimum flame for heating was crucial. The person on duty who watched the fire at night had to be on guard to make sure that no accidental embers rolled out from under the ashes. He listened to the sounds of the chimney to notice signs of soot ignition in time, which could cause smoke and fire. This was an extremely important moment, as chimneys, especially those built of wood and clay, were extremely vulnerable to fire. On nights when the cold was particularly severe, the person on duty would also throw a log on the fire if the embers were not enough to keep the heat going. In winter nights when temperatures could drop to critical levels, fire was vital. The second reason why families in the Wild West could not sleep peacefully was even more compelling. Safety. A log cabin or dugout located in the middle of the prairie or forest was a vulnerable spot. Threats could come from any direction and could be completely unpredictable. It wasn't just wild animals that had to be fought or traps that had to be set to keep oneself safe. Sometimes the threat came from other people, and although such cases were rare, they caused much more fear. Criminals or hostile Indian tribes could attack a settlement at any moment, and being caught off guard meant mortal danger. In most cases, the danger came not from the actual threat, but from the constant fear of it. The Wild West was so violent and unpredictable that settlers could not afford to relax and had to be constantly on guard. One person in the family always had to stay awake, rifle in hand, sitting by the fire, and listening to the sounds of the night. This was the watch, or sleep rotation, a strictly organized system that ensured that at least someone would be on guard at night. The head of the family usually took on the most dangerous hours, immediately after sunset and before dawn, when night attacks or other incidents usually occurred. If there were several adults in the family, they divided the night among themselves so that everyone could get at least a little rest. It was not a full night's sleep, it was a shallow, restless rest, with a constant readiness to jump up at the first signal from the person on duty. People slept fully clothed, with weapons nearby, so that they could be instantly ready for any eventuality. These naps were like sleeping on the edge. The person on duty sat in the semi-darkness, lit only by dim embers, and was attentive to every sound. The person on duty acted as a living alarm system for his family. He listened for the barking of a dog, the crack of a branch outside the window, or the alarming howl of a coyote, which could be a warning of danger. Every unusual sound put him on full alert. These were days filled with fear and stress, where every sound could be a signal to take action. He had to be the eyes and ears of the family, listening to the silence of the night and analyzing it to prevent a possible threat. This watch was extremely important, but very exhausting, and it affected not only the physical health, but also the psychological state of all family members. Such a fragmented rhythm of sleep and wakefulness was a real challenge. It affected people's health, mood, and general well-being. In the long term, constant sleep deprivation could lead to chronic fatigue, depression, and increased stress levels, which significantly impaired quality of life. But despite the severity of the situation, for the settlers in the Wild West, it was a necessary price to pay for survival. Safety and survival were more important than comfortable sleep, and this difficult choice became an integral part of their daily lives. What do you think was harder for these people? The physical labor during the day, which often included hard work in the fields or on construction sites, or the psychological strain at night, when they were constantly thinking about the safety of their families and homes? This constant stress affected not only their physical health, but also their mental health. In the next chapter, we will talk about how pioneers defended their homes when the threat became real. We will learn how families use their ingenuity and available resources to ward off hostile attacks, whether from wild animals or robbers, and what measures were taken to protect their homes and lives in the face of constant danger. Nighttime security was not limited to a vigilant guard. The entire structure of the cabin was designed with defense in mind. A pioneer's home was his fortress, and when darkness fell, that fortress was put on full alert. The ritual of closing the house was no less important than the ritual of keeping the fire burning. It all started with the door. The door to a frontier hut was not just an entrance, but the main element of defense. It was made of thick, massive boards, often in 2 layers. Its main part was the bolt. It was not a small latch. It was a heavy wooden beam, or bar, which was inserted into special grooves carved into the log walls. This beam ran across the entire width of the door. It was practically impossible to break down such a door without breaking through the wall. This bolt was a symbol of nighttime security. As soon as it fell into its grooves with a dull thud, the house was considered sealed. It was a physical and psychological barrier separating the family from the outside world. The second line of defense was the windows. In the early frontier, there was no glass. It was too expensive and fragile to transport. Window openings were covered with oiled paper or thinly scraped skin. These materials let in a little light but provided no protection. Therefore, window openings were covered with massive wooden shutters from the outside or inside. Like doors, they were made of thick planks. At night, they were tightly closed and locked from the inside with a similar, albeit smaller, bolt. Such shutters not only protected against intruders, they also retained precious heat, preventing the night wind from blowing it out through the improvised glass. And during a blizzard, they were the only thing standing between the room and the snowdrifts. In some particularly dangerous areas, loopholes were made in the walls of the hut and even in the shutters. These were narrow slits that allowed fire to be directed from the inside while remaining relatively safe. The house was ready for a siege. This ritual of locking up, bolts on the doors, bolts on the shutters, was the last thing the family did before they could even try to sleep. It was a daily reminder of how fragile the world they lived in was. The hearth itself also played a role in defense. In the event of an attack, it was the only source of light that allowed the enemy to be seen if they broke through. It also gave an advantage to the defenders, who knew every corner of the room. In addition, weapons were always kept near the hearth. A rifle hung on the wall in a dry, warm place, ready for immediate use. A powder flask and a bag of bullets lay on the mantelpiece. The whole atmosphere of the night was permeated with this need for protection. Sleep was not rest, but a truce that could be broken at any moment. And every element of the house was designed with this harsh reality in mind. Controlling the fire and ensuring safety at night in the Wild West required a specific set of tools. These items were simple, utilitarian, but absolutely indispensable. They not only sustained life in the house, but were also an important part of the nightly routine, just like the hearth itself. Throughout the night, these tools were in constant use, helping to control the flames and ensure safety. In the harsh winters and constant threat of fire, their role was vital. The main tool throughout the night was the poker. It was not just a stick for stirring the coals. The poker was a multifunctional tool that was used for a variety of tasks. It was used to stir the logs, giving them more air to keep the flames going, or conversely, to rake them into a pile to reduce the fire when necessary. At night, the poker played a key role in the process of banking the fire. This was a ritual in which the poker was used to carefully move the burning coals to the center and then cover them with a layer of ash to keep them smoldering until morning. In the morning, when the night shift began its rounds, the poker came into action again. It was used to rake away the ashes to expose the smoldering coals and use them to start a fire. The poker was almost always kept hot and placed in an easily accessible place so that it could be quickly picked up at any moment. It was an important tool for survival, allowing not only to maintain the fire, but also to avoid large fires. Next to the poker was always a shovel. This tool was necessary for regular ash removal. A lot of ash accumulated in the hearth, and if it was not removed, it would quickly fill the entire space, interfering with the normal functioning of the hearth. The shovel was used not only to clean the hearth, but also to sprinkle ash on the banked coals at night. Ash, by the way, was a valuable resource in itself. It was not simply thrown away, but collected in barrels. It was used to make lye, the basis for homemade soap. Thus, cleaning the hearth became part of the economic cycle, saving resources and time. Another important tool was bellows. Bellows were a device for blowing air onto the fire and were much more effective than simply blowing with your mouth. They produced a strong, directed stream of air that could quickly ignite even the most stubborn coals. In the morning, when the person on duty raked the banked fire, it was with the help of bellows that the coals could be brought to an active flame. A few pumps of the bellows and the smoldering coals flared up again with a bright flame. At night, bellows were used if the fire began to die out prematurely, helping to bring warmth back into the house. Fire-starting tools were always kept on the mantelpiece or in another safe place. This was an important backup kit in case the banked fire went out. These tools included tinder, dry moss, tinder fungus, or charred fabric that could ignite from the slightest spark. Next to them was always a flint, a piece of steel, flint, and wick, ready for use if necessary. This was a kind of backup to quickly light a fire in an emergency, which was extremely important in dangerous nighttime conditions. In addition, bed warmers were used to keep warm in bed. These were not luxury items, but a necessity in poorly heated huts and houses. A bed warmer was a metal, usually copper or brass basin with a long handle. Before going to bed, hot coals from the hearth were poured into this basin, covered with a lid, and quickly rolled between the sheets. The warmer did not remain in bed, but served only to warm it up, making going to sleep in a freezing room a little more bearable. It was an important part of everyday life, allowing people to sleep in more comfortable conditions. Another important tool was a bucket of water. This bucket was kept ready to extinguish sparks or in case of fire. In wooden and often dry houses, a bucket of water was not only useful, but also a necessary element in preventing disaster. In the event of an accidental spark or unexpected fire, a bucket of water could be the last barrier between the house and ashes. Each of these tools, from the poker to the bucket of water, was part of a carefully designed system that ensured survival in the darkness and cold of night. These items were not just everyday objects, but vital tools that supported safety and stability in the Wild West. In these harsh conditions, every item had its own significance and was part of a system that not only ensured survival, but also made it possible to overcome the threats of the night. The system of fire protection and control was as important an aspect of life as providing food or shelter. Without it, survival would have been virtually impossible. The tools used by settlers allowed them to keep the fire going, stay warm, and ensure the safety of their families and homes in the face of constant danger. It was not just a routine, it was a process in which every detail mattered. And it was thanks to this that people were able to survive the harsh winters and restless nights of the Wild West. Not all pioneers could afford to build a log cabin. This was especially true on the Great Plains, where trees were scarce and building resources were limited. For many settlers, their first home was a dugout, or soddy, a house dug into the ground and built from sod. It was cheap and quick to build, making it an ideal choice for those who couldn't afford more expensive materials. But living in such a house, especially at night, had its frightening aspects, which became a real test for those who decided to start a new life in the Wild West. A dugout was often just a hole dug into a hillside or other suitable location. The outside walls were covered with layers of sod, which served as the roof and facade. It was a house that could be built in a matter of days, but its construction was only the beginning of the real difficulties. Although a dugout was a cheap and quick solution, it left much to be desired in terms of comfort. In summer, such a house was cool, and if there was no body of water nearby, it was pleasant to be in. But in winter, the situation changed. The earth, being a natural insulator, retained heat inside, but at the same time created constant dampness, which became one of the main problems. The problem of dampness in an earthen house was almost inevitable. The earthen walls and floor constantly oozed moisture, especially in rainy weather. Moisture penetrated inside, creating an unpleasant atmosphere. The fire in the hearth, which was necessary for heating and drying, burned with difficulty due to poor chimney draft, which in the dugout was simply a hole in the roof, sometimes covered with turf or stones. The draft was terrible, and the smoke in the room often became unbearable. The room quickly filled with acrid smoke that brought tears to the eyes and made breathing difficult. It was hard to sleep in such an atmosphere, but the settlers had no other choice. The dugout was their temporary shelter, and they had to put up with it. The turf roof was also a source of many problems. Over time, the turf began to leak, especially when it rained. Water poured inside, turning the earth on the floor into a dirty mess, which only increased the dampness in the house. At night, drops of water falling from the ceiling could drip directly onto sleeping people, turning sleep into a real nightmare. For many settlers, it was a constant struggle with the elements to avoid discomfort in any way possible. Even a small roof leak or loss of heat meant that the whole night could be spent in a cold, damp shadow. But the most unpleasant feature was the uninvited guests. Various small creatures such as mice, rats, insects, and even snakes constantly inhabited the earthen walls and roof. At night, when everything quieted down, these creatures began their activity. Lumps of earth could fall from the ceiling onto sleeping people, and with them, their nocturnal inhabitants. Sometimes the nighttime tranquility was disturbed by the visit of uninvited guests, which added discomfort and fear to the lives of the settlers. Fire in a dugout was even more important than in a log cabin. It was not only a source of heat, but also the only way to dry the air in any way. Women kept the fire going for hours to prevent clothes and bedding from getting completely wet. A lack of fire on such a cold night could turn the house into an icy trap, and this had to be fought. But keeping the fire going was not so easy. Due to poor draft and constant dampness in the room, the fire quickly died out and had to be constantly maintained. It was a continuous task that required attention and effort from all family members. At night, it was completely dark in the dugout. In the absence of reliable lighting, if the fire went out, people found themselves in complete darkness, as if underground. This put a lot of psychological pressure on people, making them feel vulnerable and isolated. In the darkness, where it was impossible to see threats or warn of danger, the night became frightening and unbearable. The feeling of sleeping in a burrow was extremely unpleasant and repulsive, especially in conditions where it was necessary to be on guard. The night looked completely different for those who were alone on the frontier. Mountain hunters, trappers, gold prospectors. These people spent months in complete isolation. They had no one to relieve them for the night watch. All responsibility for the fire and safety rested solely on them. A trapper's sleep was even more sensitive and intermittent than that of a settler in a family. He could not afford to sleep properly. He dozed, waking up at every rustle to check his fire and listen to the sounds of the forest. Their shelters were temporary and primitive. Often it was just a simple shelter, or lean-to, built of branches and bark. It was backed against a rock or a large fallen tree, and a fire burned in front of it all night long. This fire was special. The trapper built it so that it would give off maximum heat and burn as long as possible. It was not an ordinary fire, but a reflector fire. Behind the fire, a wall of logs was built to reflect the heat toward the sleeping person. Before going to sleep, the trapper prepared a huge pile of firewood. He knew that he would have to wake up several times during the night to throw logs on the fire. He did this almost automatically without waking up completely. The fire was his only protection. It scared away wild animals, which were the absolute masters of the forest at night. The howling of wolves or the growling of pumas were a constant soundtrack to his nights, and only the wall of fire stood between him and them. The trapper slept wrapped in a blanket or bison skin, with his rifle literally at his side. His sleep was a series of short watches with himself. He was both on duty and asleep at the same time. Keeping the fire going was just as critical for him. If the fire went out, it meant not only a cold morning, but also mortal danger. Lighting a fire in the rain or snowstorm with frozen hands was a task bordering on the impossible. Therefore, each trapper had his own reliable tinder, which he kept in an airtight leather pouch. But even with it, he preferred not to take any chances and kept the fire going all night. He banked the coals just like the settlers did, but in camping conditions. A night alone on the frontier was the ultimate test of endurance, both physical and mental. It required constant self-control and a deep understanding of the laws of the wild. These people were experts in fire because their lives depended on it. Their nights were a dialogue with the wild. Fire was their only response in this dialogue. It was their warmth, their light, their protection, and their only companion in the endless, frightening darkness. We see that a simple sleep by the hearth in the Wild West was actually a complex, multi-level survival system. It was a nightly ritual that required knowledge, vigilance, and strict adherence to rules. Fire was not just a convenience, but the center of the universe, which gave life and warmth, but also carried a deadly threat. From the correct construction of the chimney to the art of banking coals, from the heavy bolt on the door to the carefully calculated order of sleep, every element of this ritual was honed by experience and paid for at a high price. Settlers and trappers waged a nightly war against cold, darkness, fire, and fear. Their experience reminds us how fragile life was on the frontier of civilization. What we take for granted today, a safe night's sleep in a warm house, was a daily achievement for them, the result of hard work and constant vigilance. What other aspects of the lives of pioneers or mountain hunters would you like us to cover? Perhaps you are interested in how they obtained and stored water, or what methods they used to preserve food without refrigerators? Suggest topics for future videos in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new research into the harsh but fascinating history of the American frontier.